Perhaps the most important thing about 3D in After Effects is that for all intents and purposes, it doesn't really exist until you tell it to. It stays out of your way. After Effects was built to be a 2D application, and if you just want to work with it as a 2D application, you can do that for the rest of time and never have to invoke any of After Effects 3D tools. But as soon as you're ready to move from the realm of 2D to 3D, there's a couple of things to know. One is that you do it a layer at a time. Each individual layer in After Effects has to be turned into a 3D layer in order to be affected by After Effects 3D controls and cameras and lights and such. Elements that are not turned into 3D layers will continue to appear in the scene, but will act like their old 2D selves and not pay any attention to those other items that I just mentioned. So, the first thing is, how do I turn a layer into a 3D layer? And that couldn't be simpler. It happens down here in the timeline. Along with all the other switches, we've already looked at things like shy, collapsing geometrics, quality, effects, etc. But way over on the right-hand side, we have this little cube, or frinkahedron. Click on that. You won't see anything else happen on screen. All we've done is toggle this little cube, but now, by turning this cube on, this layer has effectively become a 3D layer. What the heck does that mean? Well, to illustrate it more clearly, perhaps I'll start by turning off our switch again and opening up our properties for this layer. If we twirl open Transform, you'll see our typical properties that we've grown accustomed to by this point. Now when I turn on the 3D switch, watch what happens to those transform properties. Well, it's added a few. In fact, there are now so many properties that they're scrolling off the bottom of the screen. And if I bring my window up a little bit here and expand it out just a bit, you'll see that now instead of simply having a rotation property, I now have 4 properties in here for rotation. I have something called orientation, which wasn't there at all before, but also as a way of manipulating degrees. And then I have no less than 3 rotational properties: X rotation, Y rotation, and Z rotation. For the record, Z rotation, what we used to control is just regular old rotation. When you're spinning something around its central axis up here in the comp window, you are in effect spinning around a Z axis, even when you're in 2 dimensions. The Z rotation still controls that Z axis spin. In addition to that, a couple of the properties, scale for example, position, and anchor point, have all inherited a 3rd property now, a 3rd field. So in addition to defining where something is in 2-dimensional space, these 3rd fields allow us to position things or scale things in 3-dimensional space. So controlling all of these amounts is the key to animating things in 3D space once you've changed something into a 3-dimensional object. In addition to that, a whole new array of properties has shown up down here in the Material Options property. When I twirl that open, you'll see we have all sorts of stuff related to our newfound 3D-ness. But for the time being, we're going to just ignore all of these properties and concentrate on our geometric properties here in 3D space. But before we do, a potential pitfall needs to be pointed out. And you may notice as we go through this introductory section that I seem to be mentioning a lot of pitfalls. Well, that's because 3D is simply, by definition, more complex, more sophisticated than working in 2D. You just have a lot of other stuff to work with, and there are a lot of areas for potential confusion. And the After Effects team has done a pretty darn good job of implementing this in an easy-to-understand way, but there are still some areas in which you might potentially get confused. And one of those areas is with regards to these buttons that you see right here. We have this little cube that you see here in the switches. We've had some other switches that when we activated them, say the frame blending switch or the motion blur switch, that in order to then see the results in the composition, you have to in turn enable a master frame blending or master motion blur switch up here at the top of the composition. So you might, at first glance, assume that this button that you see right here, the one that looks like a cube with a little sphere next to it, that happens to look a great deal like the switch down here in the timeline, might be the same deal. In other words, you may imagine, just based on how you already know how to use After Effects, that by turning this switch on and then enabling this switch up here, you will get 3D interactions. Well, that's not what this button's for. In fact, the biggest reason it's confusing is because 3D works just fine when this button is turned on, so there's nothing to warn you that anything's wrong. But what this button is, actually, is a draft 3D button. When this is turned on, Draft 3D mode is enabled and you will suddenly lose all of the cool, wonderful things that you can do in After Effects 3D like motion blur and drop shadows and light source shading. will all be turned off by enabling this button, and you'll get really flat renders. That can really speed things up, but you need to know this is a draft 3D button, not a button that enables 3D for the entire composition. Likewise, to the left of it, the button that you see here is merely a toggle between current After Effects behavior, where if I click on the window and drag, I get an immediate feedback, as you can see in the corner of the window there. But if I add the Option key on the Mac or the Alt key on Windows, I go into this kind of draft wireframe mode. This is exactly the opposite of the way it was up through After Effects 4. Prior to that point, this was the default behavior, and you would have to add the Option or Alt key in order to enable the real-time preview that we've now grown accustomed to. If you want to default to this old behavior, if you find yourself in a situation where things have slowed down so much that you would prefer to be in what's called wireframe interactions all the time, that's what this other button is that you see down here in the timeline. Let me undo that and switch on this button. And now, without holding any modifier key down at all, I've gone into wireframe mode, as you can clearly see in the corner of the window there. And only by adding the Option key or Alt key do I get back my real-time previews. Any contemporary modern machine should be fast enough to work in the standard default way, so I wouldn't recommend turning that button on either. But obviously what we want to concentrate on here is actually working with 3D space. Now when you turn a layer into a 3D layer, you're able to interact with it now in a bunch of interesting ways. But just clicking and dragging with our arrow tool is going to result in pretty much the same behavior that we used to have. We're just repositioning a layer on screen. That is, as long as we are viewing things with our active camera, which by default is this straightforward view. We'll talk more about cameras in just a second. But just as we did before, you're free to scale a layer. You're free to reposition a layer by just clicking and dragging around. And of course, you're free to constrain where you move a layer by adding the Shift key. When you shift and drag, you're constraining things along horizontal and vertical. You may be wondering why I'm mentioning that at this point. Well, it's because the Shift key in 3D can actually get you into a little bit of trouble. But I'll let you mull over that for just a second while I bring down my tool palette here and talk instead about the new functionality of our old friend, the rotation tool. Of course, we could also get that by hitting the W key for rotate. And now if we click in here and drag, you'll see, whoa, we aren't in 2D anymore. We are now basically rotating things around in 3D space. Now, clicking and dragging inside the layer here is not necessarily what I would recommend as the first thing that you would do. First of all, for these highly angled type views of layers, I'd really recommend that you move the camera rather than move the layers, because when you have to position a whole bunch of layers relative to each other, you want to keep them in some sort of predictable space. If you glance down in the timeline window as I'm dragging this layer around, you'll see that my little trackball action is having an awful lot of direct effect on the orientation properties, all of which are being modified by me repositioning this layer like this. So if you suddenly want to take this layer and align other layers with it, and you've created some wonky orientation value like this, that's going to be much more challenging and require a lot more work on your part. So for angles like this, you probably would want to move a camera rather than move a layer. Of course, there are always exceptions to that. Let me undo that. What you may not notice with the rotation tool, until it's pointed out to you, is now that we're in 3D, it actually behaves a little bit different when you hover over one of the handles that you see around the edge of our 3D layer. If you click and drag on one of the handles in the center, it'll actually constrain the rotation around a very predictable axis. It even gives you a visual hint as to what axis you're constrained around. If you'll look at the cursor now that I'm over that point and clicking and dragging, you'll see it's telling us we're rotating around the x-axis, which is cool. Let me undo that. Similarly, click and drag on a corner and you're rotating around the y-axis, which again is cool. And click and drag over one of the corner pieces and we will get our old predictable rotation behavior back by rotating around the z-axis. Let me just undo that with Command-Z, Control-Z on Windows. But there's a problem with everything I've said so far, and that is we're affecting rotation values. We're affecting rotation around X, rotation around Y. In 3D, you have to be careful when you think in terms of rotation versus orientation, because by default, with the default rotation tool, After Effects wants us to be affecting orientation now that we're in 3D land. And this is all well and good. There are uses for orientation, certainly, but orientation doesn't behave like our old friend rotation did in a very, very important way. And that is, orientation only keeps track of absolute values from 0, meaning that the default values of the layer, before you do anything to it with this tool, the default values are 0, 0, 0. Any adjustment that you make with the orientation tools will affect values relative to that initial 0, 0, 0 value. This little adjustment I did here gives us a new orientation of 21.5 degrees, 32.1 degrees, and 353.7 degrees around the z-axis. That's fine. That can be useful. But where this gets us in trouble is when After Effects decides to animate these values. For example, if I was to now set a keyframe for orientation, and let me do that by clicking on our orientation keyframe, and I'm going to move about a second into my composition here, and I'm going to go up now and using my Z rotation, I'm going to click and I'm going to drag my layer and spin it around several times and then end up with my northernmost point of my compass pointing down left. And you see I've added a keyframe. But if I go back and look at the animation that I've now generated, I might not be getting the expected behavior because orientation doesn't care how many times I spin around a circle. Also, orientation doesn't care whether or not I've spun around the circle clockwise or counterclockwise. All orientation cares about is the first angle that I started out, which was 0, and the angle that I ended up at, which was 227.6 degrees. That's all it cares about, and it takes the shortest route from one to the other. If I scrub this value down now so that I'm just shy of 180 degrees and go back, you'll see I now animate around in a clockwise direction instead of counterclockwise, even though I haven't entered any kind of a positive versus negative value. All I've done is scrubbed our value around a little bit so that now the shortest path between these two values travels around the right side instead of around the left side. Orientation doesn't care about positive or negative. It doesn't care about number of rotations between one spot and the other. All it cares about is the most direct route between two different positions. This can be a great way to animate in 3D when you very simply want to start pointing in one direction and end up pointing in another. But if you're accustomed to working in After Effects normal 2D space and you want to rotate spinny things, you don't want to use orientation at all. You want to use rotation. So let me delete that second keyframe and turn off animation for our orientation property, and let's talk about rotation instead. I'm going to set a keyframe for Z rotation. Now let's jump back up here now that we've set a keyframe for Z rotation. Whoops, I've set it at almost 2 seconds into the composition, which I don't want to do. Let me drag that back to the beginning there. And now let me hover over our corner again, our Z corner, and drag things around, and you'll see I'm not having any effect on my Z rotation property. I'm only still adjusting my orientation property. How do I manipulate rotational values, not orientational values, here in the comp window? Now this is one of those areas that has dramatically improved since After Effects version 5. So let me show you how this works now by switching over to the After Effects 6 toolbox. Now I showed you earlier on in our series that now many tools actually have options available to you in the toolbox. And sure enough, when you have the rotation tool selected, you get this option to choose down here. It's a little pop-up. It's set to orientation by default, which is what we've been manipulating. But all you have to do when you want to manipulate rotation instead of orientation is select it in the pop-up. That's all there is to it. No hidden tools, none of that old stuff you had to know about in After Effects 5.5. Just set this pop-up to rotation, and now our tool looks the same. It kind of behaves the same, just the same as the orientation adjustment did. Let me undo that. But now, if we were to once again do what we did a second ago and spin things around, say, 3 times, if we look down in our timeline, you'll see, sure enough, we've added a new keyframe, and that keyframe is keeping record of 3 full rotations back to 0 degrees. So if we were to quickly jump back to our first keyframe and tap the spacebar, you'd see exactly the kind of behavior we would expect as our layer rotates around over a couple of seconds 3 times. A couple of other things I want to point out about controlling rotation and controlling position here within the composition involve this cluster of arrows that we see at the center of the scene. If I zoom in a click by hitting the period key, we'll get a closer view at the 3 arrows that we see. And these arrows are what are known as the axes, or I like to call them axles of the layer. I call them axles because when you're using the rotation tool, we're actually rotating around this axis like a car axle. And clicking and dragging on any one of these axles allows us to constrain rotation around those values as well. It's worth pointing out at this point that adding the Shift key while making these sorts of adjustments in rotation will constrain things to multiples of 45 degrees, as you can see fairly clearly there. But what may not be clear is when we're using our positional tool, that when we click and drag on one of these arrows, we can actually constrain along an axis as well, which is great. But because it's such a reflex to use the Shift key when constraining along an axis, you might actually add the Shift key at this point. And when you do, watch what happens. Whoop, the layer just went away. It went away because the Shift key, when manipulating the position of a layer by dragging on one of its axles, will multiply things by 10. You may think this is kind of silly, and let me undo things a ways here so that we're looking straight on the layer again. You may think this is kind of silly because why is it so important to multiply by 10 when all it does is make things fly off screen? Well, the main reason is because it can be kind of tedious adjusting things along the Z-axis otherwise. If I click right over the dead center of our layer here, you'll see our cursor turns into a little Z cursor. That tells me it's ready to click and drag along the Z-axis. So if I click and drag to the right, I'm now making my layer not larger, but closer to the camera so it appears bigger in the screen. I'm not actually changing the scale of the layer. I'm changing the position of the layer, which you can see fairly clearly if you glance down in the timeline. Only the Z position value is changing for this layer, not the scale. But as I drag to the left in an effort to zoom away from our layer, I quickly run out of real estate. I'm now as far as I can go off to the left of the screen, and that's as far as we've zoomed out. So in this case, you might want to come back in and click and drag again and drag it to the left. That's as far as we go. And do this a few times, and you're going to start getting a little tired, or you're just going to start manipulating values in the timeline instead of in the comp window. But if you add the Shift key, it makes things go a lot quicker. Let me click and start to drag and then add Shift, and you'll see we can zoom much further out, much more quickly, or much further in, much more quickly now that we've got the Shift key added to the mix. So the Shift key is incredibly useful for changing the Z position of the layer when the camera is looking straight into the scene like you see it is here. Now let's just leave this composition for a second and open up the next one, grids, and talk about the coordinate system that After Effects uses in 3D space. The x-axis, as in most 3D applications, goes from left to right. The y-axis, as in most 3D applications, moves from bottom to top. And the z-axis is considered to be the axis that is perpendicular to your computer screen from this default straight-on view. In other words, the z-axis, if it was an arrow, would be poking straight at you or straight away from you. Now, this is what's known as a Cartesian coordinate system, named after the great philosopher René Descartes, of course. The Cartesian coordinate system represents a position anywhere on a two-dimensional plane by simply supplying two numbers, one being the x value and one being the y value. If you draw a line across x and a line up y, it should give you a place on screen where those 2 points meet. Extend that into a third dimension and you can plot any position in 3D space. What's weird about After Effects implementation of this particular coordinate system is that instead of starting in the center of the universe, as most 3D applications do, instead of starting at the center of the comp with this nice 0, 0, 0, center of the world unit that you can start from and move negative to the left and positive to the right. Instead, what we have is a coordinate system that's a carryover from the early days of After Effects, where 0, 0 in any composition and on any layer is represented by the top leftmost portion of the composition or the layer. So as far as this layer and this composition, both of which are the same size, are concerned, 0, 0 is in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. Numbers proceed positive to the right and negative to the left of that, off here into the lost regions off in the pasteboard here. And similarly, along the y-axis, we start at 0 at the top and proceed in a positive direction moving down screen. This is where things really get unusual compared to many other 3D applications, is that positive Y values move you down instead of up. Now, there is no carryover Z-axis from the old days of After Effects, so Z at least defaults to a value of 0, even though it's right here in the center of the screen. But this is why, for any given composition, your neutral starting position of any layer will likely be different based on the actual scale of the composition. So your neutral composition starting point in this comp, which happens to be an 800 by 800 comp, is the center point of 400 pixels by 400 pixels by 0 pixels for Z. Now what I have here in this composition are what look like a couple of guides. These are in fact not guides. These are layers that are directly edge on to the viewer. This is a very unusual thing in After Effects. Typically in After Effects, when things are set to best quality, After Effects is always displaying for you what the final rendered version of a scene will be. Now, of course, I have a couple of handles here, and I've got our center anchor point with the little dealie sticking out of it. But even if I click off, even if I don't have anything selected in this layer, I still have these horizontal and vertical lines moving through the scene, even though we are set at best quality. What this means is that a layer is perfectly edge on to the camera. Now, After Effects is a 3D system with a completely 3D world, but layers have no Z-depth of their own. Layers are infinitely flat. So in a situation like this, where we edge on, looking at an infinitely flat edge, we would never be able to actually select this layer unless After Effects provided us some kind of visual reference for that layer. This sort of zigzaggy line that you see in the composition is here only as an aid to selecting a layer. If you click on it, you can select this layer that moves horizontally through the scene, and if you click on this one, you can select this layer that moves vertically through the scene. But when the time comes to actually render these elements, you won't see these lines. In fact, if you ever want to preview a scene that has edge-on lines like this, and you don't want the scene to be encumbered by these lines, you can use the keyboard shortcut to hide everything in the scene, and that's Command-Shift-H on the Mac, Control-Shift-H on Windows, and that will hide everything within the comp window. Note that you can still see the edges of an edge-on layer out here in the pasteboard area, but Command-Shift-H or Control-Shift-H on Windows will hide and then unhide these selection handles. Now, there are two ways to get some perspective in your scene. We've already seen that you can use the rotate tools on a given layer to rotate things along a different axis so that we see them with some sort of a three-dimensional perspective. But as I said earlier, it's much better typically to keep things on a predictable axis so that you can line them up nicely and instead change the camera angle. And if you poke around inside After Effects, one of the first places you might find cameras to look at is in this active camera pop-up that you see here, where there are a bunch of default cameras that are all stored. If we open up this pop-up, you'll see we have a collection of camera views along the top here, front, left, top, back, right, and bottom, and then some custom views down here. Let's select one of the custom views first, and that'll give us a pretty good view of our little 3D scene. Quick little zoom in here, and you can see that our XY plane that we were looking at a second ago flat onto the screen still represents the world's X and Y space, but now we have this XZ plane laying flat perpendicular to what an imaginary floor might be in a scene like this, and we also have this YZ plane, the pink plane, that runs sort of like a sidewall into the window of our world. Now, once we choose one of these custom views, we're now able to access some camera manipulation tools. Now, these manipulation tools do not work when the default active camera is chosen down here, meaning just the default camera when you enable 3D. Nor do some of these tools work with any of these axonometric views, which is what these top 6 views are called, axonometric views. What that big, long, fancy word means is basically a scene that's rendered without any perspective. If we switch to our front view for a second and zoom out a click, you'll see we have an absolute perspective-free front view of our scene. If we now go to our left-hand side of our scene, we're looking at the plane that we just saw a second ago that is oriented along the Y and the Z axis. If we go over to the right-hand side, we'll see that same plane, but now it's flipped, so the letter Z is backwards. Similarly, if we go to the top and look down, we'll see the XZ plane that we saw a second ago. If we go to the bottom and look up, we'll see that same plane flipped from the opposite direction. So these axonometric views are useful to actually get a quick look into a scene, But if you click and try to modify any of these views with the orbit tool, which is what this first tool is called, it won't work. You can actually pan and zoom into these views, but you cannot orbit the views because there's no perspective at all. Instead, to use the orbit tools, you want to start in one of the custom views, or of course we want to add our own camera, which we'll do a little bit later. But now that this custom view has been selected, I can take my orbit tool, I can click and drag, and similar to the kind of trackball effect that we had earlier, I can adjust this view, and now that becomes my custom view 1. If I switch to custom view 2, I get a more front-on view, but I can adjust that as well, add a little bit more perspective. I can then switch to custom view 3 if I like, and fine-tune that if I want to. And now if I go back to custom view 1, it'll retain the presets that I just set. Why is this important? Because the custom views are the only views in this pop-up that are available to you via some keyboard shortcuts. F10, F11, and F12, you'll see that they allow us to toggle through a few different views. F10 takes us to our front view, F11 takes us to custom view 1, and F12 takes us to our active camera. These are the default presets that ship with After Effects, but you can override these presets. So if I go to custom view 1, and I'll hold the shift key down and hit F10, I have now set custom view 1 as my F10 preset view. If I switch now to custom view 2 and hit shift F11 and move over to custom view 3 and hit shift F12, now if I let go of the shift key and just tap F10, F11, and F12, I've now given myself 3 nice little quickie keyboard shortcuts that allow me to navigate from zoom level to zoom level. Okay, this is fine, but I have to say this is not the way I personally prefer to work. Instead, I prefer to take advantage of one of the coolest new features introduced in AE 5.5, and that's multiple views. At any point that I'm working, whether in 2 dimensions or 3 dimensions, I can actually create a new view for my composition. Now, by default, your new view actually may show up in its own window. It may not. But once you've created a new view, you can set that view to be any camera that you want it to be. In fact, you can pretty much set any parameters in here, including the resolution of the view, whether or not you're just looking at the alpha channel, whatever. But for us, let's say we want to just create a few views that coincide with the various cameras that we have available to us in our camera pop-up. So here we have by default a view that is the front view. Let me add that to our main composition window here. Then we'll create another new view and set this one to left. I'll drag that into our comp window. Create another new view, and let's set this one to custom view 3. And drag that into our comp window, and so on. I've now got 4 views across the top here, and I can fairly quickly tab between them by just clicking with the mouse on the tab, which is a nice way to toggle from view to view. And obviously, if you have a lot of screen real estate, which I, of course, almost certainly have less than you do because I'm presenting on an 800 by 600 screen for the sake of this video, but if you have a larger screen, you can keep as many views open at the same time as you like, which is a really great way to work. But a little-known keyboard shortcut that I love to use in this circumstance is the Shift key followed by the period and the comma keys. Now, you know the period comma key, that's what you use to zoom in and out of a composition, right? It's a great shortcut. But add the Shift key in a situation like this, where you have multiple tabs in a comp window, and the period key will move forward through the tabs. The comma key will move backwards through the tabs. So you can add as many views as you want into a comp window, and then quickly with just Shift, period, I can jump over a couple of views, move back one with a comma key, move forward two with the Shift, period key again, and so on. And I can quickly toggle from view to view to view, allowing myself a great window, or as many windows as I like, into my 3D space so that I can quickly set things up. Now, a couple of other important things to know about these various views, the ones that are available from this camera pop-up, is that you can't render from any of these views. You may spend a lot of time getting things fine-tuned in custom view number 2, but guess what? You're not going to actually be able to render from that view. The only view you can ever render from is the active camera view. Now, as you add cameras to a scene, they will also show up in this pop-up, but ultimately, you're going to be rendering the active camera. And when we talk about cameras a little bit later, I'll tell you what exactly makes a camera active. But the front view, the left view, top, back, right, and bottom, these are all very useful working views, but you can't render from these views. You can, however, modify them somewhat. Should you need an axonometric or orthographic view available from the side here, and you want to actually pan around inside of it, you can. You can actually pan this view. Very useful. You can also zoom out or zoom in on this view. So if the lack of perspective is a useful view for you, but you want a bigger view into your scene, your pan and your zoom tools actually do work. Add the shift key as you're dragging around to multiply the zoom values, by the way, and you'll get a much, much quicker zoom and get further out on the scene a little bit quicker. Let me undo that a couple of times and see if I can return our screen back to where it was before. Now, let me hit the Shift key and the period key to take us back around to our custom view 1 here. And I'll use my rotational tools to get us back to a view that looks a little more traditional custom view 1 there. Why is it important to know about all this? Why is it important to know about your x-axis, your y-axis, your z-axis, and all these views? Because knowing where you're looking from is one of the most important things that you can know when you're adjusting values on a layer. Because if you're looking from the front side of a layer and you're adjusting something's z position, pushing it away from you is going to result in a positive change along the z-axis. All right, pulling it towards you will result in a negative change along the same axis. But rotate that view around so that we're from the back, perform the same action, and you will get opposite results. Pushing the layer away from us now results in a negative value, and pulling it towards us will result in a positive value because we're looking at the scene from a different angle. But it's really important to know where you're looking from, in addition to how your layers themselves are situated. Now, another important thing is we've got our pink layer selected here. As you see, our axles are oriented along with the layer. That allows us to do this nice constrained motion that we've just demonstrated now several times, where we can manipulate a layer relative to the plane that that layer lies on. Now, we can do this because the switch that you see in the bottom of the toolbox here is set to layer mode. This switch tells us that the axles on any given layer are relative to that layer. But click the little box next to it, and instead of layer view, we go into what's called world view, which means now the axles have flipped themselves around a bit, and they're relative now to the entire world space, which is essentially the original space of our XYZ layer. If I select our XYZ layer, which we haven't otherwise modified in any way, it still lies on the XY plane. You'll see that its axles are identical to the axles of the YZ layer, which has been rotated around. Let's take a look at a more dramatic representation of that by taking our rotation tools and making this layer particularly wonky so it's not parallel or perpendicular to any other layer on screen. And you'll see even with our axles set like this, switch back to world view, and we can now manipulate this layer, its position at any rate, relative to the rest of the elements on screen, or at least relative to the original world space, and our other elements happen to be existing perpendicular to that space. So let me undo that a couple of times. The third option over here, the plane that you see on this little switch represents your computer screen. So anytime that you reach into a screen and just click and drag and start dragging around, you are actually operating in screen relative mode. Now, the best way to illustrate this is to open up my top view here, and let me pull it out of our scene, and let me adjust its size so that we can place it up next to our other layer here, which I'm going to scooch off to the right a little bit, and I'll position this right next to it. In fact, since I'm going to be switching between these layers, I need to make sure that I have as little pasteboard area on both of these layers as possible. So let me scroll both of these in and reduce their pasteboard area quite a bit so that these two can exist next to each other on screen, and I can freely toggle between them without covering one up or the other. And now you'll notice if I click on this layer here, you can see that that layer is clearly selected in this window over here. And if I adjust its x-axis off to the right, you'll see that it's clearly being adjusted on its x-axis because its x-axis is currently set to world view, which happens to be perpendicular to this top view that we see here. But if I just click and drag the layer here to the right, you'll see it breaks the relationship of the layer as far as left and right is concerned, and we're no longer constrained to a predictable plane. And the reason is that we are now manipulating this layer perpendicular to the screen itself, meaning everything is happening perpendicular to the view that we have right now. This right-hand switch kind of does the same thing. When we click on that, you'll see that the axles in this scene, if I zoom in a little bit on the scene, you'll see that these axles now line up so that the blue one is pointing straight at us. And if we wanted to move things away from the screen now, we would click and drag on that blue axis, or drag down and to the left, and you'll see in the window it's moving away from us. But when you look at the top view on the left there, you'll see it's also moving in a way that's seemingly unrelated to the axis of the other scenes. So, very important to know about this behavior. Very important to know that when you adjust things from an angled view like this, just clicking and dragging is not necessarily going to give you a predictable result. You're going to end up with things moving at funny angles. It's much better when you're trying to line things up to try to use these axles to position things. That'll always make sure that you can kind of predict the direction that you're going to be moving in. And be aware that you can fine-tune the positioning of those so that they can be relative to the screen, relative to the original world, or relative to the layer itself. So feel free to toggle between these as you're setting up your scenes and fine-tuning stuff. Now, one other important thing regarding this, and that is, if I close this down and go back to our intro comp, the very first comp, just click it open, there's our intro comp, and let's go down and right-click on our position and reset it, and our rotation and reset it, and get rid of our rotation keyframes by just clicking on the rotate property there. I'm going to twirl down my properties and turn on my other two layers here. Got some white marble, some black marble, and the compass layer. Only one of them is currently 3D, so I'm going to turn the other two on now as 3D layers. And let me choose my white marble and my black marble and parent them to my compass layer. So now anything I do geometrically to my compass layer will be inherited by the white and the black marble layer. And let me select layer 1, because I'm going to use layer 1 now to control these other layers, since I just did the parenting thing. Now, if I select our rotation tools, I can rotate back this collection of 3 layers in space. Now, if I go back far enough, you'll see that these are all perfectly flat. They all started out as similarly scaled layers, similarly positioned, all exactly on the same X, Y, and Z coordinates, but there are 3 layers here. There's the compass elements on the top, then there are these white tiles, then there is this black marble background. So, similarly to working in 2D in After Effects, whenever you have a situation like this where you have multiple elements that all occupy exactly the same plane in After Effects, I've zoomed in a little bit. Let me pop this up to full so we can see a little more clearly. Whenever you have elements like this that all occupy the exact same plane, they are drawn in stacking order according to the same rules that you would follow if these were 2D layers. Since they're all coplanar, basically they're being drawn in order from back to front based on the order that they're stacked in the timeline. But if I select layer 2, which is our white marble floor, and I drag that up a little bit, you'll see now in the window the marble floor is drawn in front of our compass details. Even though they all occupy the exact same place in 3D space, they're being sorted differently on screen. So this is an important point. This is how elements are sorted when they are coplanar. Doesn't matter if we're looking at the front of the layer or the back of the layer. I just spun around and now we're looking at the other side of this collection of layers. The order is drawn based on the order in the timeline, nothing else. In all other cases in After Effects 3D, in every other situation but this, elements are sorted on screen not based on their stacking order in the comp window, but rather on their distance from the camera. So if we select one of these layers, the compass layer that you see here, for example, which is being drawn behind the white layer, but is still selected. If we hover over its little axle and manipulate it on the Z-axis, Well, you're going to see it's going to bring the other elements along with it, of course, because I parented everything. But now that we've rotated everything into place here, let's break the parental relationship. I'll choose none for these two, so now I'm free to move these different elements separately. Now with my compass layer selected, I've still got my axles, and if I hover over the blue one and adjust it, you'll see the slightest adjustment pops that entire layer, so now it's in front of the other layers. It works that way because that layer is now, as far as the After Effects camera is concerned, closer to the camera than the other layers. So it's being drawn in front of it. However, things get a little bit weird when you start intersecting layers with each other. If we click on our rotation tool again and rotate this layer now back towards us, you'll see we're getting a nice intersection between planes. That's because this composition is currently set to use the advanced 3D renderer. You may not find yourself in this situation by default. In fact, the default settings for After Effects 3D compositions at the time of this taping is to have the standard 3D renderer chosen in the Advanced tab here of the composition settings. When the standard 3D renderer is chosen, you'll see, whoa, our layer has now suddenly disappeared behind the other layer. We can adjust its sort order again so that it moves a little closer towards us, and then boom, the whole thing pops through. Now it's gone. Now it's back. When the standard 3D renderer is in place, all After Effects cares about is how far the center of the layer is from the camera's view. It really gets kind of confusing because even the anchor point doesn't matter here. It just calculates the center of the layer, and based on where the center point is of any given layer, the closest center point will draw that entire layer in front of the other layers. So you end up with these interesting sort of clipping problems where things sort of seem to pop in front of and behind other layers. If you find yourself in this situation, make sure to go to your composition settings into your advanced tab and toggle things over to advanced 3D, which will allow layers to properly intersect with each other, and those sorting problems will go away. So those are the most important things you need to know about navigating in After Effects 3D space. We've talked a little bit about the cameras. We've talked about the various views that you can see your scene from built into the comp window. But for most 3D projects, you're not going to want to use After Effects default camera settings. You're going to want to create and work with your own cameras, which happens to be the topic of the next lesson. But before we get there, there's one other important thing to talk about, something that's been newly added to After Effects 6. So I'm going to actually move all the way down to the end of our list of project files and quickly open up composition number 8, and let's talk for just a moment about OpenGL acceleration. Let me open that up. Now, a little important background about OpenGL. OpenGL is a standard for video cards, where rather than the processor on your motherboard being responsible for representing 3D information on screen, it's actually handled by special processors in your video card that have been optimized for drawing 3D objects. The most common place you've probably run into OpenGL before is in video games, or if any of you come from a background where you've created 3D modeling in an application like Maya or 3D Studio Max, you've certainly come across OpenGL in the past. But before After Effects 6, OpenGL was not included as a part of After Effects, which is a shame because After Effects seems particularly suited for OpenGL. There aren't that many polygons, really. It's just mostly textures on a small number of polygons. It should be easy to manipulate that kind of thing with OpenGL. Well, it turns out in After Effects 6, it is. Sort of. One of the first and most important things you'll need to know is whether or not your OpenGL card is actually supported by After Effects OpenGL. And I can't tell you that in this lesson. You're going to actually have to poke around a little bit to find out. I mean, one obvious thing you can do is actually try to interact with this lesson as we move along and see if it works or if it doesn't. If it doesn't, in all likelihood, your card is not currently supported by After Effects OpenGL, and you might need to get a newer, quicker card. If you'd like an answer a little more specific than that, I recommend that you go to Adobe's website, find the support section, and they should by now have posted a document of cards that are and are not supported by OpenGL. For example, you may have noticed that we subtly faded over to Windows. We not only faded to After Effects version 6 from the 5.5 demo we were giving, but we've also faded over to Windows. And the reason we did that is that the OpenGL card that I have in this really, really fast Windows machine is, in fact, much, much faster than the one that I had on the Macintosh and supports a wider array of OpenGL features that I want to show you here. Now, as it happens, this is a pretty good scene for demonstrating OpenGL because it's got a ton of different layers. They're all set to best quality. They even have motion blur applied to them because there's some motion going on in the scene, although motion blur itself isn't affected by OpenGL. But with the default After Effects rendering settings turned off, and you do that in this little button right here. We visited this earlier in our comp window introduction way back in the first set. But if you check this pop-up out here, these are where you choose the various options related to OpenGL. I've got them turned off right now, so if we were to quickly scrub in the timeline, you'd see we get fairly chunky behavior and we don't get smooth motion. If I change that to adaptive resolution, you'll see something that you've seen earlier on where it actually drops the resolution of the comp down to try to draw things more quickly, and you end up with this real pixelated effect. Well, OpenGL is designed to keep the quality much higher than that. And what I'd like you to choose is OpenGL with static textures. That's going to get us the absolute best quality performance out of the scene that we see here. It turns out every single layer in here is a movie. Each of these little planet clips that you see in the scene is a movie. So OpenGL, even in the best situation, is not going to really help us out much if we choose moving textures, because each and every frame of the texture is still going to need to be fetched from the hard drive in order to be drawn on screen. So moving textures is going to slow us back down again. If we only had 1 or 2 movie clips in there, your machine could probably keep up with this just fine. But we have so many movie layers here. I'm going to switch this to static textures, which means it's going to essentially do a freeze frame on each of these movie clips. And now watch what happens. I get really smooth interaction, real-time feedback out of OpenGL. So this is pretty great when it comes to actually setting up your scenes. But if you look really closely at the timeline, you'll see I've got a handful of little green ticks there indicating that those frames have been cached into RAM. But as I'm slowly dragging across, I'm not adding any little green ticks. Well, it turns out that OpenGL is not a render format. It's not even really a preview format. It's only a working format to give you quick interactions with the scene, but it is in no way caching these. You can't use OpenGL to do RAM previews, and you cannot use OpenGL as a render setting. You can only use OpenGL to interact with scenes and help you to set up 3D scenes very quickly. Now let me change the lock here on my adjustment layer so that I can turn on a blur effect on top of my OpenGL layer. Now watch what happens when I scrub. I click and scrub, the blur completely goes away. OpenGL is pretty selective about which effects that it tries to show you in real time and which ones that it doesn't. But it doesn't work with adjustment layers at all. So if you have an adjustment layer in a scene, do not expect that to render using OpenGL. Also, don't expect to be able to interact with masks, etc. in real time. Those will not be affected by OpenGL. Once again, OpenGL is about getting a position in the right place. And of course, it works absolutely fine with cameras, etc. You can use OpenGL to very quickly manipulate a scene and position a camera exactly where you want it in that scene. But don't expect it to interact with adjustment layers. Don't expect it to interact with effects. A couple of other things to know about with OpenGL, and again, a lot of this is just telling you what will and what won't work, frankly. Let me turn our adjustment layer back off again. I'll lock that and do a select all, and then I'm going to adjust the transparency of our layers down. I'm going to scrub those down a bit. You see we aren't getting any interaction at all in the scene up there. OpenGL obviously doesn't adjust that. But now that our transparency settings have been set way down and I hit F2, if we scrub a little bit, you'll see OpenGL does a just fine job of representing partial transparency in a scene. It's kind of dim on your screen now, but you should be able to see what's going on. Got about a 40% transparency there. However, that only works with basic transparency set to a normal transfer mode. If I select all again, crank my opacity back up again by just scrubbing the values with all the layers selected. Let's go to a value of about, say, 60% or so. And I'm going to toggle over to my transfer modes. And let's pick a different transfer mode. I'm just going to hit Shift plus at the top of the keyboard, not the plus on the numeric keypad, but Shift plus at the top of the keyboard to start cycling through a few different transfer modes. And let's choose Add. Add is a nice transfer mode where we can see layers brightening any layer that they pass in front of. Let me deselect all the layers now, and you can see very clearly Add is happily represented in our scene up here. When I now go to scrub our timeline again, you'll see that the Add mode disappears. When I let go of the mouse, the add mode comes back. So transfer modes do not work with OpenGL. If your scene changes suddenly while manipulating things with OpenGL turned on, it's because you're trying to render something that's outside of the realm of OpenGL. The only reason I'm showing you this is because you're going to want to be very, very familiar with this button that allows you to choose the OpenGL settings or not. In general, unless you are setting up a 3D scene, I don't really recommend that you work with OpenGL because it changes your screen so dramatically based on what you're doing. I would just stick with adaptive resolution or even turn things off if your machine is as fast as the one that I'm working on here. This 3 gigahertz Pentium 4 with a really fast video card is quick enough for most tasks. But do know that the OpenGL settings are here to help you set up your 3D scenes and that you can easily turn them off to set up the artistic portions of your scene. Now we've manipulated the view of our scene here quite a bit using After Effects camera controls, but what we haven't really talked about in any detail yet is exactly how to work with After Effects cameras. Well, that happens to be the topic of our very next lesson.